Okay, I think we are ready to go here. This is sort of a inclusion of HandmadeCon 2015 inside HandmadeCon 2016, as I sort of mentioned on the schedule. So those of you who are at HandmadeCon 2015 know that these are the speakers, minus Mike Acton. He couldn't make it, but everyone else is here who was at the original conference. And what I wanted to do was just kind of take the opportunity to do sort of questions and answers, because that wasn't something that, as you saw even in this conference, during 90 minutes, we typically take the entire time to really get all of the stuff that we want to talk about, just that I'm asking. So what I wanted to do was have a session that was just kind of freeform, where we could go through a lot of the questions that people had that they maybe would have asked if we do audience Q&A. As it said on the mailing, basically I collated on the forums all the questions that people submitted, and I'm just going to kind of go through them and ask questions of various people on the panel who the questions were directed at. Some of them are directed at everyone, some is directed at only one. But the idea here is just that it's, much like the rest of the sessions, anything goes, so anyone who wants to talk about any topic is welcome to jump in at any time. You don't have to keep it to just like, oh, this said that this question was directed at Tommy, so only Tommy can talk, or anything like that. It's totally free for all. So anyway, for those of you who are not at HandmadeCon 2015, let me just do brief introductions. We've got Ron Gilbert, Pat Wyatt, Tommy Reffinis, and Jonathan Blow. Each of whom you probably saw their talks online. So let's give them a warm welcome, and I'll get started with the questions. So before I ask the first question, I just wanted to go quickly through and just go like, hey, what's going on? So we'll start at the end. Ron, what have you been doing since HandmadeCon 2015? How's it going?
Just working on my game.
So Thimbleweed Park.
Stressing about it, panicking about it, all those normal things you do when you're developing a game.
What's the panic level right now?
Oh, it's really high.
Really high?
Yeah, no, it's really high because we're gonna probably ship the game sometime in February.
Okay.
And everything's going great with the game, and we were getting ready to do all the voice recording. There's like 15,000 lines of dialogue in the game.
Wow.
And we were getting ready to do the voice recording, and then all the actors went on strike.
Right.
And so we kind of had to scrap all of the casting that we had done, and we've started over with the casting, and now we're going to record it in Vancouver next week.
Okay.
So it's like super stressful right now.
Wait, you don't think that?
I thought it was a limited
we're getting started
strike.
already, but say again.
No, it's not limited.
Okay.
No.
So the strike is universal across.
Well, it's for interactive titles.
Okay.
And it started out a little bit more limited, but then a lot more actors kind of went into it. And there was this thing that you could do if you wanted to record during the strike, where you could basically agree to the new contract that the actors wanted and record outside of it. But then a lot of the people that do the signatory type stuff were very leery about signing the new contract. So it just made more sense to just get out of it and go to Vancouver.
So basically the situation is right now, if you're doing voice recording for a game and you do want to do it here, it's somewhat in limbo. Like you don't even really know if you can do it.
If you want to use union
actors, right?
Yeah, you could use non-union, but if you want to use union, it's kind of...
Well, thank you for coming, even at panic level 17 or whatever. So Pat, how about you?
So very shortly after the con last year, I started at Amazon, so I've been there about a year, Amazon Game Studios. And we're working towards the release of the first PC game, which is called Breakaway. We just had an internal test about a week ago. Actually, I guess there was friends and family would be the best way to describe the test. And in December, we'll be doing a full-on alpha test. There's still time to sign up if you like. Playbreakaway.com.
Oh. This is an open test. You do not have to have any kind of special invitation to do so.
Well, what they're going to do is, like lots of people sign up, and then they'll pick a subset of those people to play in the alpha test.
Okay. And can people like come up to you after the show and be like, hey, can you put me on the secret? Can you bias me into the secret list or something?
I can try.
No, I'm just kidding. Tommy, how about you?
Just stuff.
All right.
Yeah. I wrote a scripting language for fun, because I didn't have anything else to do.
What kind of scripting language? Oh, because Ron, the scripting language.
And John also, right?
Yeah. Well, yours isn't
his is a
scripting,
real
yours
language
is like,
now,
yeah. Yours is a whole thing. Mine was just like, I needed something where people that were afraid of C++ could do stuff in my engine, and I don't like using other stuff, so I was like, well, I don't have anything else to do. I'm just going to write a scripting language, so I did.
How'd it come out?
Very well.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. No, it was the reason it came out very well is I had a ton of fun doing it,
Okay.
and I just enjoyed it. And every time I would be like, oh, I want to add this thing, I'd be like, fuck yeah, I'm going to add that thing. It's going to be awesome. So, and then I did, and now it's over, and now I'm sad. Because it's done.
Start another one.
I might, yeah.
Problem solved.
There's templates.
Yeah, oh, I almost did templates, but now the little pre-compiler thing is fine, so.
So is this something that you're ever going to release? Is there going to be like .trs files, like, or something like this?
It's
that,
called TomuScript. Yeah, it's pretty good.
You're always so creative with the naming. It's such a broad palette.
Right, yeah.
Okay.
Yes. No, I probably won't release it because it's just in my engine, so.
Okay, so it's not necessarily a scripting language that might become something people would be interested in using outside
I don't
of it.
think so.
Okay.
Like, it ties into stuff in my engine specifically, so I mean, you could because it's all separate from the engine, but, you know, why? Just use Lua. Like,
But
I don't want to support it.
But
so.
you didn't use Lua.
Yeah, but I don't have to because I wrote my own. So. Yeah. So yeah.
All right.
That's
And
about it.
John, how about you?
What level of involvement counts as worth mentioning?
I feel like this is speaker discretion level of involvement, so you can actually
all right.
set this dynamically. to
Okay,
where
I'll
you would
just
like
I'll
it
just
to
cover
be.
all the things,
All
right?
right.
So we released a game this year in January, and
What game?
so we've been doing ports of that to various platforms, and then we just this week put live our PS4 Pro plus HDR patch. So we're going back and doing support for other things. HDR was pretty fun. I didn't do any of the programming specifically for HDR, but it was more like, you know, high-level discussions and decision-making and stuff. Because a lot of the things that you do in an engine, you know, for efficiency purposes, because you could do them multiple ways. One of the ways you do them is sort of like maybe aftertone mapping or whatnot, right? And none of that stuff works if you need your output to be HDR, and some of those things don't even make sense.
Right.
So, you know, one of the cool tricks we did was I forget what game it came from, but you know, there's a thing where you take a screenshot and then you put it in Photoshop and like you tweak all the hues and like any control you have in Photoshop like transforms the image, but also a stamp in the corner that's like every RGB color, or enough of them that you can interpolate, right? And
Well,
it
the
doesn't
idea
make
behind
any
it-
sense in HDR at all, right? So you have to like completely like all the color correction in the live color correction in your engine has to get rewritten and stuff. And so I didn't do that, but did Andy do? Andy, are you in the audience? Did you do
Yes.
that? Yeah, so Andy did that.
Okay.
But no, I don't know who did it. So, but we had a lot of we had discussions about that. So that's been fun. And then so more personally, what we're doing, or what I'm doing more personally these days, is sort of starting stuff on the next game, which is an interesting project because there's two next games. One of them is going to be in the engine and code base that we've already spent so much effort like building
Meaning
up and
the
stuff.
witness
The
code
engine,
base.
yeah. But it'll hopefully be a project that's smaller and more tractable than that and stuff, which is always what people say.
Yeah.
But we're going to try to really do it.
Okay.
And then, you know, the other one, so I'm also building a programming language. And as a test that that's a real thing, we're also making a game in that.
Okay.
So it's a little bit, you know, it's maybe not the smartest decision to do multiple things, but that's
Yes.
just what is happening. So,
Okay. So this is one of those cases where we do know ahead of time that this is a bad idea.
yeah. Yeah.
But we have decided to accept that feeling as a feeling and move ahead.
If people never did things that were bad ideas,
Yes,
you know,
that's a very good point.
like starting a rocket company is a pretty bad idea.
Yeah.
But that works out
Yeah,
sometimes.
sometimes.
So, yeah.
All right. Well, let me move on to questions then, and I don't have any particular order for these because they're not super theme-based. Like, people had some pretty, I guess, the questions that were asked ranged all over the map, from things that are relatively specific code kinds of questions to things that were like just purely psychological, like dealing with, burnout or things like this. So I'll just kind of jump around in it. I'll start with, I also should say, some people sent in, here's my name, like, so, you can attribute the question. Other people didn't. So I don't know if that was because they missed the part in the submission thing that said, if you would like me to read your name when you do it, please put the name in there and how to pronounce it so I can pronounce it, or if they really didn't want me to say their name. So I apologize to anyone who wanted me to say their name and just didn't see that notice, but here we go. So we'll start off with one that's sort of, I guess, not really a code question. It's from, I think I'm going to pronounce this right, but Edine Segal. The handle is the 8th Mage on the Twitch chat, and it's from Israel. So the question is, Tommy, you tweeted about imposter syndrome, specifically in relation to HandmadeCon 2015. Can you talk a little bit about it and if and how it influences your day-to-day work and feelings? And this is interesting to me because people ask me about this on the stream too. And my answer briefly there was just like, we never had a name for this thing, but I would be pretty shocked if programmers in general didn't typically feel like they really just don't know what they're doing because it's such a vast topic. So I am kind of interested to hear what you had to say on it as someone who's, totally different perspective perhaps on it.
Yeah, I did a GDC talk, like the little soapbox rant thingies about it. And my whole thing was, I have a whole bunch of friends. That's not bragging. Like, but I have a bunch of friends, people I work with and around and stuff, and they all like make these amazing things, and they think that they're garbage.
Okay.
And I think that about stuff that I do too. And for me, what I talked about in relation to HandmadeCon last year is I was up here with you and Mike Acton and all these really, really accomplished people, and I just felt like I sort of belonged, even though right before I came to HandmadeCon, I'm like, why the fuck am I coming to this thing? I'm not, oh yeah, am I not supposed to cuss?
Oh, that bridge got crossed a long time.
Okay, 'cause I only saw some of the streams yesterday, I didn't, yeah.
I try not to cuss on the mainstream because those videos I thought could maybe be used for something educational at some point or something. But I didn't even want to try to keep, especially this panel, from having any swears in it.
I'll try, but
yeah, feel free to ignore that. There has
self-censor.
been several swears at
Okay,
HandmadeCon
good.
already, so we've
Good.
already burned that bridge.
Good, it wasn't me.
It's
I'm
not
not the first
you.
one.
It's
Okay.
not you. You're just bringing it home. You're the
Yeah.
closer.
But yeah, so this didn't work. Okay, hello? Okay, so I was up here and I just felt like I belonged, and the whole point of that talk was to just sort of tell everybody that those feelings are natural. They're
Okay.
something that I feel like it's a mechanism to keep challenging and understanding what you're good at. So for me, I don't think I'm really good at, much of anything. But I am, though, because, I've made a video game that sold well. People like the controls. I feel like I know what I'm doing with programming, but it doesn't matter. Every time I do something, I'm like, this can't possibly be the right way to do this.
Okay.
But, it keeps working out. And, it inspired me to just sort of take other leaps. Like, I just recently, made a comic book.
Okay.
For no reason.
Okay.
The reason was I didn't have anything else to do, so I decided I'm going to make a comic book.
So that's
And I did.
2 things you've done because you had nothing else to do.
Yeah, it's been a weird year.
Okay. Okay.
So, yeah, the whole point was kind of everybody feels it. It's not something to be ashamed of, and if you realize that other people have it, maybe people that you look up to, because I know there are some people who look up to me, I don't know why, but they do. And if they know that, hey, I kind of feel this way too, maybe they'll be like, hey, it's not bad for me to feel this way. So.
Yeah, because I feel like at some level that's the sort of thing that can be like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you're constantly thinking that I'm not good enough to do this thing, then you probably won't be able to do that thing because that's what you're focused on, rather than just going like, look, we all are really bad at this thing. Like, game development is just difficult and error prone, and it's not a science. And it's like, there is no such thing as like, oh, I learned to play the piano and here's the notes and it came out great or something. It's like, nope, it's like very fuzzy and weird. So at some point you just have to maybe say like, I just got to try, you know, I just got to try, and failure is part of this profession on a daily basis, right?
And it is, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Did anyone else have anything they wanted to add on that one at all, or before I kind of pull
Well,
another one out of the hat?
I
Ron?
find that imposter syndrome, at least for me personally, is highly motivational, because I often feel like, well, what I'm doing just isn't any good, or
Okay.
other people are doing stuff that's a lot better, and that really motivates me.
Okay.
I think I'm somebody, and I did a whole talk on this. I think I'm somebody. I'm very much motivated by fear. It's
Okay.
like I become afraid that something else is better than what I'm doing, or I
Okay.
become afraid that my thing is crap, and that really pushes me forward to kind of be better and do better stuff. So at least for me, I find it very motivational. Some people do not, but for me, I do.
So in some sense, if people who maybe struggle with this a little bit can change their thinking around, maybe try to think of it a little bit as like, look, the fear part of imposter syndrome is like, I think it's like, okay, well, let that fear motivate you, like, run away from that thing by
Right,
doing, challenging yourself or doing work that allows you to sort of demonstrate to yourself that you can do it, sort of as a more motivational tactic rather than just a cowering sort of thing.
Yeah, that's the way I treat it.
So let me move on to the next question here. This one, well, actually, this person submitted a couple different questions. So I'm going to pronounce this incorrectly because they included a note, and this is probably for the best, that said, I don't care how you pronounce the name. And they're from Shenzhen, China, so my ability to speak Chinese would be laughably bad, so that's good. Panfeng Zhang is the person's name, and their handle on the Twitch chat is Bolaban. And his first question was for John. He said, the development period of The Witness is much longer than Braid. Like, how did you come through the demotivation and self-doubt part? I guess he's assuming that there was one. I mean, although I guess you did in the Attempting Deep Work talk probably talk a bit about that. But
Yeah.
And then they kind of asked the broader question, is there a general method for everybody? So I think mostly just what they're trying to get at there is like, psychologically, how do you deal with this?
Well, Braid was not a short development. It was like 3.5 years from beginning to end, which is, for most people, would be a long project.
Yeah.
Maybe even not so much these days, because everybody's projects have gotten longer and longer. So 3.5 years is less long today than it was in 2008 or whatever when it came out, but it was still unusually long. But that was, I mean, if you're a runner and you run some short distances, and then you can run some medium distances, then you can run some marathons, then you can run some ultra marathons or whatever, right? You just build it up. You build up the muscle. There's sort of two things. There's at least two things that are skills that you can deliberately build. Well, one of them is deliberate. So the one that's very deliberate is just learning how to pay attention to your own mental state.
Okay.
And regardless of what you have to do about your mental state, because that's a hard question to answer. Like, I feel really a certain way today. Why is that, and what do I do about that? Well, the answer to why is that is actually usually too complicated to even understand it, because people are complicated, right? But you develop the habit of at least looking at that and then taking care of yourself, right?
Okay.
Similarly to the way you might look at your posture, as we were talking about this morning, and move around a little bit. You just I'm not having a good time right now, and you just, at least you notice it, and then maybe you change something a little bit. And even if you don't know what to do about that, the fact that you're paying attention to what is going on is, I think, at least 2/3 of the battle. Like a lot of people, don't notice that something bad is happening until it's really late, and their life sucks, and they just want to quit their job and divorce their, or whatever. But I think there's a lot to be said about just constant attention, just taking care of yourself, right? But the other one
Before
is,
you move on from that, I just have kind of a unpacking question there.
yeah,
So, like, if you assume, or at least sort of implicit in that was that, like, okay, so normally when somebody eventually sort of gets to that point
Yeah.
where it's gotten too bad, right, and
Yeah.
it's too late or whatever, what do you suggest in terms of learning to sort of figure out how your mental state is developing much earlier on from that? Like, are there specific, do you think it's different for everybody, so you're just gonna have to kind of work it out on your own? Or do you think it's the kind of thing that's like, no, like, hey, spend 5 minutes in the morning every day going like, how am I feeling today about some various things, just actually pause and think about it? Is there any kind of an actual thing there, or is it just like, who knows?
see, it's really hard because I think it's, so when I say notice how what's
Yes.
going on right now, right away that is actually very difficult because it's
Yes.
all tied up with notions of identity and
Yeah.
stuff. So you actually have known me for a long time,
Yes.
right? You knew me like sometime in the late 90s when I was still doing my first
Yes.
company, which I'm glad I did it because I became a much better programmer through that. But man, it was not a very fun experience.
Okay.
Or whatever, right? And I definitely didn't have this kind of attention to my own, mental state or whatever, and I became really depressed by the end of that. And I burned myself out enough that I couldn't program effectively. I couldn't program at 100% until like a few years ago. Right?
So it's like a
So,
decade or something.
Yeah, and I was at like 20% for a couple years, and then it
Wow,
came up to
okay.
30%, 40%. It took a long time to get better, right? So it was like a physical injury in that way,
Okay.
right? But so when I go back to that time, right, one of the reasons why I didn't have a good eye on what was going on was because it was partially like my identity was like, I had a little bit of a, I don't know, the exact word is not hitting me right now, but it's like when you don't have that great of an opinion of yourself, right?
Self-esteem?
Yeah, self-esteem. It's
Or
not exactly
self-image,
it, but
maybe.
something like
Yeah,
that,
okay.
right? And then if you're not happy today, you're like, of course, right?
I see.
So, but that may not be true for somebody else. Somebody else has a very different relationship to how they feel about themselves. So
I see.
I don't know if there's a general statement that can be said about that, but just noticing. And the other reason I say just noticing is because conclusions that you come to, I guess I said this, but they're usually wrong. So.
Okay.
But then the second thing is just, once you've had a successful project,
Yes.
this is why I recommend people maybe do shorter things first. Because you
Okay.
do something successfully, and you went through maybe a little bit of that period of like, oh man, I couldn't handle this, right? It felt so terrible. But then you actually come to the end,
I see.
and your brain actually sees that there was an end, right? And
Right.
that you got I mean, hopefully your project didn't totally fail, right? One of the reasons I think why I stayed burned out after the first time was our project was not successful, right?
Okay.
We got a few players, it was successful in the sense that I learned, but it was not financially successful. Nobody played it. I got
Right.
no external validation
Validation,
from the
yes.
world, right? But with Braid I did,
Yeah.
and then it was easier to get up and do a longer thing.
Because at that
Right.
point, your brain knows, it's like, okay, I'm going to have to go through a bunch of stuff to
Yeah.
do this, but I believe now that there is a light at the end of the tunnel.
Somewhat,
kind of thing.
you semi-believe, right? Because one of the properties of being, and I don't know, you're probably a little further than this right now, but when you're in the middle of development, and like we talked about this last year, so I won't go too far into it. There's a
Okay.
discussion of it last year, but you're in the middle of development, and the to-do list just gets longer and longer and longer, right? So if you extrapolate that, it goes to infinity, right? Your game will never be finished, right? In reality, that'll collapse down eventually. But at some point, it's like wandering through the desert and your brain doesn't believe it's ever going to end. But if you have the past experience of like, no, this is just like last time, and it did end, you can at least remind yourself of that at a rational level, and then maybe you can invoke some imagery to like help with the subconscious.
Right, so just
parts.
any kind of standard mental things that you find work well, just use those to try and get that association and be able to kind of pull yourself out of it a little bit, or, connect yourself back to the time when you're like, I did feel this way in the past and it got better, like I don't need to despair kind of
Yeah,
thing.
but of course, that advice is limited to the portion of people who have had a successful
Yes,
project.
the first time through,
Right.
not so good.
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess I'll open that up to anyone else too, because I mean, everyone here has had to go through long projects. So does anyone have any kind of
I think there's the problem is that most games and game companies are started with a sense of optimism that is indubitably false. You just have this belief that like you're going to get something done in a certain period of time, and as John mentioned, the task list grows longer and longer, and it's the discovered work that you didn't think about until you got to that point in the project, and you realized, oh, we don't have a solution for that yet. We haven't even thought about that yet. Well, that's more people, and you've already got a budget, and you see the money dwindling and the scope increasing, and it's hard to figure out how to get through that. And so even if you want to do things like, oh, maybe if I just took a little bit more time off, or if I just gave everybody a week off, well, if only we had money to do that, that'd be great, but we can't. So I do think, and actually I want to tell you one story where that did happen. I mean, I was 3 years into Guild Wars, and that happened, where it just seemed like we would never be able to release the project, and it ultimately took us 5 years. So, I mean, I think it's really common in game development, and I think the thing you really have to do is figure out ways to get yourself out of the headspace of what you're working on and do something else so that you're not just keep, grinding away against the problem. Your brain needs time to actually do other things. And in fact, I mentioned this during the last talk, but if you spend too much time doing one thing and you don't get enough sleep, then you actually are preventing your brain from performing properly. You won't generate the chemicals you need to remember things, for example. And so it's important to actually have some space away from what you're working on so that your mind can actually rest, so that you have a better chance to go back at those things. And they need to triage and figure out like, okay, well, we can't do everything. And that's the way that you ship games, is by triage.
So is it generally the case that, or I mean, I shouldn't say generally the case, but does it sometimes serve as an indicator that like, if I'm having sort of absolutely crushing feeling of like, this is not gonna go, like it's just epically messed up or whatever, that maybe is also a good indication to go like, okay, maybe step back, take a little time, but then maybe let's think about, can we, break this up? Can we do something like, can we pull back a little bit? I mean, when you say triage, do those things tend to go together? Meaning, is the time for triage when you're just like in that headspace and can't see a way out of it, or not?
Well, I think you probably have to, because it's hard to just sort of step away and like, well, I'm just gonna not do this, yeah. Right? The people that you're working with are depending on you to keep money flowing into the studio, yeah. And so you can't stop for too long. So you do have to be capable of doing this even when you're feeling badly about the project. Yeah. But I mean, there's great examples of teams that have done this. I mean, Blizzard obviously has enormous amounts of money that they can spend, right? But they had a project where they spent many millions of dollars, like $40 to $60 million are the estimates for Titan, and then like they had nothing at the end. But they stepped back and they thought about it, and they said, we really want to prove ourselves. And they went back and they did Overwatch in a really short period of time by thinking about what they had and what assets they were able to put together, and now they've got Overwatch.
So in some sense, it's like, hey, maybe we can't actually succeed down this path, but maybe we can pick a path that we could succeed down that isn't that far away from where we are right now, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. That's pretty interesting.
I think when you're doing triage too, I don't think you want to do triage kind of at the height of your panic and paranoia. You want to do it the next morning. Right. It's like get out of that of that headspace where everything is doomed and is totally fucked up. Because if you do that, you'll just start hacking stuff out of your triage until you feel better. But if you kind of wait till the next morning, I mean metaphorically the next morning, whatever that is, you're in a better headspace to now go, okay, let's triage. Let's look realistically at how much time we have, how much money we have, and the list of things to do.
All right. So I think that's actually really good. I believe that is well beyond what I was thinking there would be for an answer to that question, because it's kind of a tough one. Let me grab one here. Let's see. So this one is for Pat, and it's on, it actually uses two acronyms that I don't know. So I'm not sure. I wasn't sure about them, but I'll give you the first part first. It's actually two parts, and this is more of a code question. The question is, are there any differences between debugging a non-net game, like a non-networked game, and an MMORPG game? Meaning the approach to debugging that you take. Is it just the same kind of debugging that you would normally be doing, just now there happens to be network involved? Or is it like the fundamental approach to debugging changes in some way? And sort of the chaser on that was, are there any like silver bullets for debugging in MMORPG, like techniques you would employ for these that you might not have thought of or come across because they are really only applicable in this sort of scenario?
So I do think that there is a silver bullet, which is rare in software, and that is that if you can figure out how to make your game replayable from the same set of inputs, then you can reproduce the same set of bugs. And so the trick would be, you're recording every input and the timestamps, and it's actually pretty easy to do in single-player games because they're not generating that much input, and you've got a giant disk that you can store everything on. And so just write everything, and then you should be able to play that simulation back into your game, and if you did everything right, then it should crash the same way.
Right.
And that's something that you have to put the work in up front to make sure that your engine is capable of doing that, but then it's really easy to debug. And that really naturally extends to multiplayer as well. And in fact, we built Guild Wars that way, so it was game recording for crash discovery. And it turns out it actually has some additional features, which is you can do load testing. You just run lots of streams at the same time. And then also it ends up being a user feature in that you can play recordings back for players. You can stream it out to the other people's clients and they can watch the game. So I think it's super useful if you're architecting your engine like that.
Is it possible to architect an engine that way with multi-threading these days, though? Because at some level, recording inputs only works if those are the only inputs. But with multi-threading, the scheduler, or the OS scheduler, is kind of a separate input, which is kind of hard to record. Have you worked on any projects since that jump kind of happened? Or is that like kind of a thing that's like, well, yeah, you could, run the game single-threaded or something, or I don't know. Does that make sense to the question?
Well, if you look at each of the agents in your game as like an actor, right?
Yeah.
Actor model programming, then each one of those things can be played back independently.
Yeah.
And so you can just record their own input streams so they're isolated from other components. Now, as soon as you start sharing memory, then it becomes really problematic. And oftentimes, what looks like an actor simulation is really a global variable bashing simulation. And those are hard to fix.
Yeah, in the sense that if you, at some point, assuming that the thing is multi-threaded in sufficiently, you're going to have shared resources that are contended in some way, and the order in which people hit them is not going to be deterministic necessarily. So I'm only bringing this up now because this is something that I thought about a bunch. Like I've worked on code bases in the past where it did have input recording, and code base I'm working on now, I would love to have input recording, could not really figure out a way to do it, at least not the way that I used to do it, given the fact that all kinds of things are multi-threaded internally now. It seemed like you would have to start recording the multi-threads, like when people were taking, mutexes or something would have to be part of the recording or something. I never really quite got to the point
Can
where
I ask something about that?
Please do.
Because it seems to me there's two different classes of bugs, right? There's one class of bug that's like some kind of thread-related bug.
Yeah.
In which case, yeah, that's always that kind of situation,
Yeah.
right? If it's a kind of bug where it's like something about the actual logic independent of the implementation and the timing and stuff, then the way that you tend to think about input recording is like it happens on frame boundaries or something, right?
Yeah.
And then if your threading causes results that are going to differ beyond one frame anyway, then maybe that's a bug. Like if the coordinate of your object ends up slightly different if this job runs before this job, then that's a little bit, you at least want to know that, right? I don't know if you do anything about it, but, and in some cases that might be intractable, I guess, for performance reasons. Like I don't want to get super picky about the order in which collision resolves, but.
Well, I'm more thinking of it because this is not a thing, we're not talking about something that we'd ship to end users necessarily, well, you may for debugging, but
Yeah.
the point is, this is not something that's used necessarily in the course of actually doing something in the game. This is strictly for debugging, and so one of the most common bugs you can have in a multi-threaded engine is a threading bug.
Sure.
So it seemed like it was like, well, if I'm, if my idea here is that this is for debugging the system, saying that a whole class of bugs, which are bugs we're very likely to have in any kind, in the kind of code that it cares about this, seemed like a problem. It doesn't mean you can't still use the system for, once it is multi-thread bug-free, now you can still play it back in the same way. But I was just curious because, it wouldn't surprise me if someone said, oh, no, just do this. Change all your mutexes into this thing which logs who took the mutex when or something, and then we just replay them in that order, which, theory might work, but I don't know.
It's really problematic, and especially if you think about processors getting more and more cores, then what's going to happen is that kind of solution is going to be more and more difficult to debug. And so what you really need is a system that looks at the work you have to do more like a job system.
Yeah.
And so jobs, it's like, here's a set of inputs, go off and do something, and then there's a set of outputs. And so that's eminently recordable.
Is it though? Because you don't know, you mean recordable in the sense that just record which cores got which jobs and then just do that again when we come through. So basically the job system now will record that order and play it back. So
That's right. Now, so there are certain types of bugs that you can't stop, right? Like memory corruption bugs are just nasty because
Yes,
it could
yes.
be anywhere.
yeah. So I've often found, this is now going totally off of this person's question. I've hijacked the thread. So on that topic, I would be interested to know your opinion on this. So I find oftentimes that the job system model is less good than I like it to be, for the reason that oftentimes things, the parts of the multi-threading that I care about in terms of performance stuff tend to want to do just very brief access to a shared structure rather than reserving that access for the entire length of their job. And that's the kind of bug that I tend to be worried about in this scenario, because it's typically like a little hand-coded thing that maybe you made because this is a critical component or whatever. Would you say the same thing, or are you more of the opinion that no, generally there should just be job system and that sort of manages resource locking, and you really shouldn't have much in the way of custom kinds of multi-threaded stuff happening?
Yeah, well, I mean, when you get into client rendering and stuff, it can be really complicated. But
Yeah.
in general, I think that it's better to try and use job systems where you have larger blocks that you can separate off
Okay.
and send away, as opposed to, like, here's a loop, I'm going to have 10 threads all run the same loop and do different parts of it at the same time.
And so do you usually see job systems as having sort of that locking happen sort of at the head end, basically like, okay, this person needs to access the database or something like this. So we will just not let any of the other threads access the database at that time or something, so that we don't have to have some kind of a fine-grained locking mechanism in there. Just pulling an example out. You would prefer to generally say one thread gets one resource, and then you just try to architect your resources so that's not too bad, or?
Yeah, or you would use something like, this is a much more complicated solution, but something like Postgres MVCC, which is, I'm not sure I can actually pull out what the acronym stands for, but the idea, multi-version concurrency control, I think, is you have lots of different versions of the thing, and when you lock it, the version that you have stays constant for the duration of the job, even though other people are getting later versions of the same data. So that then, like, your job system has version 34 of the data and can use it and not worry about it changing out from underneath it during the course of the operation.
So that's assuming that you have a system where that particular piece of data doesn't have to be sort of, meaning the access to it is mostly read-only, I assume, because writes will now possibly collide with each other or something like this. Or maybe you resolve those after the fact, something like this.
Yeah, you're just using a stale version of the data.
Stale version, okay.
I feel like that's very domain specific, right? And there's some cases when you can't do that, like hypothetical situation.
Purely hypothetical?
Say you were dumb enough to try and multi-thread a compiler, right?
Right,
Internally.
okay.
And you've got a job system, right? So you've got a basic job system that goes off and does things, and one of the jobs is like walk the syntax tree and figure out the types of all the expressions in the syntax tree, right? Well, if you lock the syntax tree as a resource, now you're not parallel anymore, right?
Right.
Even if you lock a subtree of the syntax tree, you're gonna, in that way that like locks pile up really fast,
Yes.
that's just gonna happen, right?
Yes.
So what you really wanna do is, some kind of like lock-free thing that uses a very small amount of data that maybe like that data lives in the node, and you do compare exchanges or whatever you do to like just atomically change that one
Thanks.
value, right? And I don't, not having completed that part of things yet because it's fully
I think you meant
hypothetical.
if the hypothetical programmer had not completed this hypothetical
But
project.
I don't see, on the one hand, I don't see another way to possibly do it. I mean, there are like, you could, okay, the syntax tree is laid out somehow flat in memory, and we've got a read-only copy, and occasionally we like blit parts of it to the new copy to try and update, but that seems almost as complicated, and it has performance penalties that you're making multiple copies of this thing that you'd rather only have one of. But I don't see another way to do it.
Well, in that
So-
particular circumstance, it's definitely one of those things where, like, in a game in general, you've got lots of different work that you could be doing. So then job systems tend to be things that can sort of be more effective because, hey, there's all this different stuff to do. Chances are they don't
Yeah.
all need to do the same data. Whereas the compiler's like, look, we're just doing the syntax pad. That's all we can be doing right now. So there's not like a lot of opportunity to say, go do those other things you were going to do and let me just play with the syntax
Yeah,
tree,
to bring it back more to mainstream games a little
Yeah.
bit, I feel like it's if you wanted to parallelize your AI
Right.
without taking performance hits of duplicating your knowledge base all the time, right? Like How do you do that? It's just going to get hairy unless somebody comes up with something that I've never heard of, right? So maybe part of what you do as an engineer is like, don't do that, right? Or you make your system fast in other ways, or you buy, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I feel like if you can just have a job system and serialize at the job level to reproduce the work, that sounds great.
Yeah, I mean, if you can get it to that point, it does sound pretty good, because then you know, the other, I suppose, aspect of that is that if you do have a job system that you can record, you can also look at your efficiency that way. You can look at the job system's records and say how many long were jobs waiting, when did jobs go in and out. It could be a useful debugging tool for things that had nothing to do with catching, breaking bugs. It could be stuff for, I just wanted to know how my scheduler was working. Maybe there's things I could do to make my scheduler better, like where are the bubbles. And so the recording of a job system could have another benefit, I suppose, in that way. But, all right, that was, I thought we were going to have, I was worried if we ran out of questions before the time was
That's not
out.
gonna happen.
And there's zero chance of that.
I bet some of these folks have questions.
So I'm going to ask the part of the question now that have the acronyms I don't understand. So we can either skip this one if nobody knows what they are, or someone can tell me what they mean. The question was, for data analysis such as DAU or ARPU.
Oh, daily active users and
Okay.
average revenue per user.
Okay, so these are things that single-player game devs don't know. Okay. Do you have separate systems for game manager or operation department access? Does the data typically come directly from reading the database? They sort of had a little explanation here about why they were interested in this. They're saying the former company they worked for, accessing the database affects players who are online, so they had to wait for them to go to sleep, typically, to do this sort of thing, then read daily reports about the money that they spent and so on. And so they were just sort of saying, how does this sort of thing work? And I guess implicit in the question is a more well-working system than the one that this company that is not named has.
Yeah, well, so the first thing is that you want to have multiple databases. You have a transactional database, what's called OLTP, online transaction processing, which is sort of like your bank of knowledge that players are using. And then you want to have I think it's OLAP, which is your analytics database. And they can be optimized to be different types of databases, right? Like one's a traditional SQL database, and the other is a column store database because you need to roll up columns. And the idea is that you're replicating your data from your store of true knowledge about what players have in their accounts to your other database. And you do it like every 4-8 hours, once a day, something like that. So your analytics are going to be out of date, but it's not as essential, right? You don't need 5-minute interval on most of the data that you're looking at. Like getting a report in the morning. What happened yesterday can be very useful. And so, you should have multiple databases for that problem.
And so when you have multiple databases for these things, is the structure always the same for these, or is there I write through one database and then it writes out to another database, kind of a pattern for it, or is it always like the game writes to both databases, or the server rather writes to both databases, or is there anything tricky about that, or just it doesn't matter, that's not relevant?
Yeah, there's lots of different ways to do it.
Okay.
Like one is just you're replicating to a slave database,
Okay.
and then it's capable of answering a different set of queries
Okay.
because they're all read queries.
Okay.
Also I say database, right? Like there's only 2 of them, but one thing is you're taking in all this data and you've got your master database and you've got all these events, and then you've got like a slew of third-party tools, like your own internal databases and external companies that analyze your data. And so you want to think about it not as there's a central point of knowledge, but rather there's a stream of events that goes wherever you need to go in order to be able to answer different types of questions, whether it's the operations team looking at player behavior for security purposes to identify bot players, or the marketing team looking at analytics to discover whether the offers that they're making are working effectively.
Yeah. Did anyone? I assume that no one else had to add on this one, since I think the rest of us are only single player. Okay, I think that was all from that question set. So let's go to a question this was Tommy and John. And this was an anonymous submitted question. So it was, both Braid and Super Meat Boy were extremely successful games. I'm wondering if there are parts of the game that you weren't quite happy with and that you would have liked to spend more time on, or is everything exactly the way that you wanted it? Now, I asked this question not because I'm at all wondering what the answer is, but more just because I feel like the fact that it was asked kind of means maybe we should talk a little bit here about the reality of what you achieve when you're programming a game.
Yeah. There was a lot of stuff that I don't like playing Meat Boy because I just see it as this kind of flawed piece of buggy, shitty software. But yeah, like content-wise, there was a lot of stuff that we wanted to add that it just came down to it, and it was like, well, we can either add all that stuff and not come out on Xbox, or we can cut it all and be done with it and have it come out on Xbox, and then go on with our lives. So yeah, there were several things. I don't think I should name all of them because maybe they'll be in another one, but probably not. But yeah, of course.
Okay.
I don't. Maybe John had put everything in Braid that he wanted.
Yeah, I have a different, right, so the triage discussion that was happening
Right,
earlier
just
is, I've been fortunate enough to never be in that position. Like, it was always a possibility to just keep working on the game. So that's why The Witness took a long time, for example, is because, we could have said, well, we have to ship this, N years where N is less than,
Right.
I always feel like, well, if you put some amount of time into something and you're really close to making something really great, but it's going to take more time. If that's your goal of making something that's as good as you can make it, then by shipping the thing that's not as good as you can make it and starting over, you're just increasing your time to that goal.
Okay.
Right? So if you don't have a financial forcing function, like forcing you to ship, and if you don't have a, I'm going to go insane if I don't ship this year or something, right? Then, like, if your goal is to do good work, you can do good work, more good work in one game, or you could split it among multiple games, but it's still all good work, right? So neither Braid nor The Witness shipped with anything that I am, sad about. Like, we kept working on the two. There's always things that you didn't get to do.
Right.
But, if you start and the things are this big and you keep splitting the boulders or something and they get smaller and smaller, the to-do list always gets longer, but the items on the to-do list get smaller. So the sum of them in some calculus way eventually starts adding up to very small amounts, right? And
I'm
so,
not sure I followed the math, but I
Well,
followed
what-
the analogy.
You're summing a larger number of things that where the number of things grows smaller than the size decreases, whatever.
Okay.
Anyway,
The size decreases faster than the number multiplies.
So there's stuff in both games that I didn't totally, that are not ideally perfect.
Okay.
But both games are way better than I thought they were going to be when we started.
Okay.
Right? So you
Okay.
can't beat that, I don't
Okay.
think. I mean, with The Witness, the biggest problems we had are stuff that was beyond our control anyway. Like,
Okay.
shipping an ambitious 3D game on the PC right now is a nightmare. We spent like 2 months
Yeah.
just dealing with graphics driver things.
Yeah.
That, so, and I don't even know what you do to prepare for. I mean, if we had a much larger budget, we could have
Giant testing lab.
had a
or
giant
something.
testing. Yeah, but like the Radeon 3770 has a problem, but the 3790 and 60 don't, right? Like,
Well, obviously.
That kind of thing. That was really our biggest problem with The Witness, and it wasn't a problem with the game.
Right,
It was
right.
just the environment that we're in. Yeah.
But, Tommy, where is the crowdsourced system configuration bug database that we were promised last year?
Okay, so my
Am I
part's
wrong about
done.
am I misremembering this?
No. My part's done, except for the Linux and the Mac version. I just don't have a web guy.
That's it?
Pretty much.
But you got all the spare time that you could
Yeah,
learn
but-
to learn it.
How hard? Okay. It is very hard to find, and I'm very sorry, I don't mean this in the way that it's going to sound. It's very hard to
Famous
find.
last words, Tommy.
Finding a good web guy is difficult, all right? And I know this because I used to be a web guy, and I considered myself one of the good guys because I wasn't a web guy. I was just a
Okay.
software guy.
Okay.
It's very hard to find a software guy that does web stuff because they're just doing not... ugh. It's very painful because the thing I wrote is simple, but people just want to make it so complicated when they put like 13,000 little systems to do one thing.
So basically, you were looking for somebody who can do the minimal amount of necessary web
I don't
over.
need 15 frameworks to serve 5 pages, okay?
Are you saying that? That's only 3 frameworks a page.
I know, which is considered good now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, but that is what you're actually waiting for, is somebody who would do a good minimal job of a layer that could put this thing on the web?
Basically, yeah. I'm trying to push Matthew Wegner, who's a good
Okay,
friend, who
gotcha.
is like a web genius,
Okay.
to finish his game so he can do stuff.
Is that Aztez? Which game
Yes,
is that?
Aztez, yeah.
Okay, yes.
I'm trying to get him to finish it.
Okay.
I mean, he's trying to. It's not like he's like, oh, I'll just wait, you know. But yeah, maybe once I have like a good, dependable web person, because I'm not doing that again.
Okay.
I did my crappy PHP version of it.
Okay.
It worked. It looked like garbage.
Okay.
So I need something that's functional and doesn't look like garbage, and then everybody can use it, but not until then. So
Well-
sorry.
Oh God. Okay, so let's move on before anyone says another jQuery from the audience. Okay, so we're mostly down now. Let me see. I'll ask a couple of these. We're mostly going to be down to questions that were not directed at anyone. They were just questions for everyone, basically. But I got a couple more here. So, Ron. This question is from Tomasz. I'm not going to pronounce this one right either, but even though they spelled it phonetically, I'm going to try. Tomasz Ruzhansky, I think is, if I'm getting that correct. But they didn't list a city that they lived in, so I'm not sure where they're from. The question was using pixel art in Thimbleweed Park your very first choice, or did you consider some kind of stylized 3D like in The Cave? And they said, what are the pros and cons of each approach in the project like this?
For Thimbleweed Park, pixel art was our first choice for that.
Okay.
Because we were, the kind of the whole impetus of the Kickstarter was really, kind of going back to what was the charm of Maniac Mansion and Monkey Island. And, my kind of thesis on that is it really has to do with the pixel art. And so, we kind of wanted to go back and look at that and go, all right, is pixel art a key component in that, in that charm? And I do happen to think it is, because I think pixel art, the objects in the game or the actors in the game, they're more icons than they are actual things, right? It's like, this is not a toaster, it's an icon of a toaster, right? This is not a secret agent, this is an icon of a secret agent, because the pixel art just removes so much fidelity in that. And I guess it's like the difference of reading a book versus watching a movie, right? Players can fill in, so much more about things, where if you're doing these really nice, like high-end, even 2D, very high-end 2D stuff, you filled in so many blanks for the player. So that was kind of, our original idea, and so it really was about pixel art.
So that's very interesting. So essentially what you're saying there is that, like, if you go high fidelity, it's not simply the case that going high fidelity is, more difficult or whatever, because it means we have to spend more art resources or more time optimizing an engine or something like this. It actually fundamentally means that people lose the ability to apply a certain amount of imagination to what they're seeing. So you're sort of saying, like, literally they cannot have the same experience that they would have had, because in one case we're telling them exactly what the experience is, and in another one we're kind of saying, here's a suggestion of what is in the experience, and you're going to fill in what you sort of have in the background.
Correct.
That's fascinating.
Yeah,
Okay.
it is, and it doesn't mean that the pixel art is just crude and ugly and
Right.
stuff. I mean, pixel art can still be incredibly beautiful
Yeah.
and artistically drawn.
Yeah.
And pixel art to me is not drawing high res art and then going into Photoshop and then reducing the resolution.
Right.
Pixel art is like hand placing every pixel, where you want it to be for the scene. So I think there is a real, artistry to really, really good pixel art.
And so there's a follow-up to this question, but I guess I just want to sort of ask the part of the first one that it kind of, not to try to say this, they kind of alluded to, which was they mentioned the cave in Thimbleweed Park, and then they sort of said, are there pros and cons of each of the projects? So I'm stepping away from Thimbleweed Park, which obviously just already, like you said, it's like, no, the goal of this was to have this experience, so obviously we wouldn't consider doing something in the cave. Is there anything else in the pros and cons other than the one we just sort of talked about, which is that you lose that imagination part? Can you maybe say if there's anything else to mention there before we go?
Yeah, there are a lot of pros and cons. I mean, just memory, right?
Okay.
It's like, the entire background for, a background in Thimbleweed Park is, less than a lot of icons, that say on people's desktops. So
Yeah.
you certainly, doing really good pixel art, you do save a lot, in terms of memory. I think the other thing that's kind of a little bit advantage, and it gets back a little bit to the imagination thing, is when you're kind of doing like characters the way we do in Thimbleweed Park, things don't have to work precisely, and your mind kind of fills it in. So, right, a character can kind of reach for a doorknob, and they can really kind of not really touch the doorknob.
Right.
And because you're filling in so much of this imagination, you accept that. Where if you're dealing with like really high-end, 2D art, you start to notice that this person didn't touch the doorknob when they reached out for it. So there's a lot of things that we can do because it's pixel art like that. A lot of shortcuts that we can get away with that speed up development and et cetera.
So it kind of keeps you away from having to deal with a lot of these sort of corner case sorts of stuff that would come up if you were doing.
It's kind of like, it's almost like the uncanny valley in a way, right?
Right.
The nicer your art becomes, the more people expect everything to actually work correctly.
I see.
Where if it isn't, then
So you kind of need to be on either side of that valley. Like either we go pixel art and then people just kind of understand that this is a
Right.
representational thing that they're seeing and they will fill in the gaps, or we had better get all the way to the hand actually turns on the door. Otherwise
Exactly
people are
right.
going to kind of notice the jankiness of that.
Yeah.
So, okay. All right, so same questioner also asked, what was more important while designing the Thimbleweed Park? To innovate and push the genre forward, or to preserve the warm, fuzzy feeling of nostalgia? How hard is it to resist the sweet taste of member berries, they said. I think you kind of already answered this, but I thought I'd just read it so you can answer it definitively.
That was a really, really hard line to
Okay.
follow, right? Because we were trying to build a game that again captured the charm of
Right.
those old games, and I think a lot of what those games did is a part of that charm. But on the other hand, I think that if you look back at point-and-click adventures made around Monkey Island, Maniac Mansion time, there were a lot of flaws in them, right? I mean, we are much better game designers than we were back then,
Right.
and so there's just a lot of stuff in Thimbleweed Park where it's like, what, we want to kind of capture that charm thing, but on the other hand, we just want to get rid of all the stupid stuff.
Right.
And so we have spent a lot of time, learning over the years and learning from what other games have done, games, like Firewatch and all this other stuff, and how they approach things, and go, what, those same things can be applied to this point-and-click game. So it's like, we kind of describe it as, we don't want Thimbleweed Park to look like an old point-and-click game. We want it to look like you remember those old games looking.
Okay.
So it's like we're going to kind of take that aesthetic, but we're just going to kind of move it forward in a lot of design ways. Plus that we use shaders and all this other stuff in the pixel art. That it's more of what your imagination imagined that Monkey Island actually looked like when you played it as a kid.
So you're kind of, the person's brain has sort of completely painted with a new brush what Monkey Island looked like
Yeah.
back then, and they're sort of thinking, oh, I love the artwork from Monkey Island, whereas if we showed it to them now, they might be like, oh, that's not what I remember. So you're kind of going for the more like, this looks like your brain's image of Monkey Island, even though this might not really be what Monkey Island
Right.
looks like. Kind of
And you know, Mark Ferrari, who did all the art, I think he put it best, is like, you know, people want to go live in the Renaissance Fair. They don't want to live in the Renaissance.
That's great. Okay. All right, let's pick one of the other questions for everyone here. This question comes from William Bundy from Redlands, California, who I think is here, but well, maybe not. Maybe he's up there somewhere. Oh, in the booth?
Oh, yeah.
He's in the booth. There he is. The question is, how do you approach making and designing in-house tools? Do you devote time to designing workflows for them? And what do you want from third-party tools other than fundamental things like stability, speed, and functionality? Those are kind of two separate questions, so we'll just start with the beginning one, which is just like, how do you approach in-house tools? Sounds like Tommy approaches them by, if he had nothing else to do, ...
Honestly, yeah, that's kind of,
he makes an in-house tool.
it really is, yeah.
So does anyone want to start on that one? I don't know. That's kind
So
of...
like, how do you approach making them, or how do you approach deciding whether you're going to make one?
To be honest, I'd like to hear the answer to that first one for sure. I'm sorry, the second one. Like, how do you know? Because there's always some jankier solution you can do that doesn't involve making a tool, right? Like some weird, I typed
Excel
some code
files for
into.
the win.
What'd you say?
Excel files for the win.
Excel files for the win. So there's always something you could do that doesn't involve making your own tool. So the question is, yeah, I'd like to know, how do you figure out when to make them, when to not? That'd be pretty interesting, I think.
Well, for my stuff, I usually spend a lot of time looking around to see if I can find a tool that would do what I need.
Okay.
And if I can't find that tool, then I'll kind of go into doing them. And obviously, I mean, even doing pixel art, I really don't want to build a graphical editor that can do pixel stuff. I look at Photoshop and I go, you know what, this can do what we need.
Okay.
So it's like I don't need to rebuild the tool for that. But the other things, I really felt I need to build a tool for this, right? I can hand edit text files, or I can find some off-the-shelf thing that we're going to fight with the entire project, and you just kind of decide, you know what, this is worth my investment, to spend, time. And at Thimbleweed Park, we had a tool that laid out all the rooms, where you kind of put all the images in position and tagged all the hotspots and laid down all the walk boxes. And, I kind of decided early on, it's going to take me probably 2 months to build this tool. That's probably worth it.
Okay.
And I just decided up front, okay, 2 months, I'm going to build this tool because it's such a workhorse on the project, and there just is nothing else out there that is like this.
Which I guess kind of tends to be what you do see in a lot of game engines, is that like kind of the map construction process, or whatever you will, where you're kind of pulling assets together and making them do
And
something.
I think that's the only custom tool on the project. Everything
Okay.
else is off-the-shelf stuff.
And so is that something that it sounds like that was entirely foresight, I guess, in the sense that you did not start doing this thing without the tool and then realize that this was a bottleneck in production or something like this and then go do it. You were more just like, and this may be because you've had so much experience with these kinds of games though, but you were just like, I just know this is going to be a problem, so I'm just going to do it right up front.
Yeah, because we had a very similar tool in the Scrum system
Okay.
that did the exact same thing. And
Okay.
I just knew how important that
Important it
was
was.
and how much people used that thing, that I just knew doing this, I need a tool like this. So
When you
I
were
was-
doing it on Scum, how did that tool come about? Was it, when did people figure out we should probably build one of these?
Well, that one was very organic, right?
Okay.
Because, when we were doing the first version of Maniac Mansion on the Commodore 64, I mean, it literally was hand editing text files,
Yes.
right, to get everything positioned. And that just kind of grew slowly over time to get that tool.
Okay.
I think some of the equation comes down to how big your game is going to be, and so how many people you envision working on it, and the fidelity of execution that you need.
Okay.
Right. So if something like animation, right? Animation people really care about. It's got to look good, and so if your animators have to go and edit text files, which is the way that some games actually worked in the old days, then the iteration cycle is really slow for the artists, and they're not going to get that fidelity. And especially if you've got a whole bunch of animators that are going to be working on the project, then it would make sense to invest in the tools for that, if that is like a key criteria for the success of your game. Because everything you implement is something else that you didn't implement somewhere else, because you've only got so many hours or dollars until your company goes out of business. So yeah, thinking about what tools you can reuse. And then if you're going to do something that nobody has done before, then you almost certainly have to build tools. Right? If you're making an outdoor game and you don't have an outdoor engine, then you're going to write an outdoor editor, or you're going to have a problem. I would say one thing about tool development too is the most important thing, like stability was mentioned, but I would say it's not just stability, because everything's going to crash once in a while. It's can you recover after the crash? Like,
Okay, crash
is
recovery.
it saving every 30 seconds would be great, or alternately it's like it writes out everything at the point that it crashes, and so that you might have some chance of recovery. That's really important for internal tools.
Because you just know, hey, these are things that are in flux, so we're going to have crashes. We're not going to have perfected it by the time it's in production, certainly. So prepare for crash. Like make crash preparation a thing. So John, did you have anything?
It's complicated, right? Because you can easily spend a lot of effort making your own tool, and then it still kind of sucks to use because it doesn't have all this iteration of professional tool, right? You have to keep in mind, though, that when you license a professional tool, or a commercial tool, it's not really going to do exactly what you want, and so you take a loss from putting up with it, right? And there's a cost, there's an ongoing cost to like dealing with it, that the fact that you don't have control over this thing, right? There's a cost to the fact that that tool has an end of life that is not in your control. So if you want your game to be re-released 20 years from now, because that's just what you want to do, right?
Right.
You don't want to make perishable goods, then, which I guess is a single player concern more, because with multiplayer, your player base is just gone eventually,
Yeah, so
right?
maybe
But, that has to be considered, right? Is this tool going to block me? If it's something like an animation creation tool, probably not, right? But whatever. Of course, if you're going to build your own, then it takes longer than you thought, and it's going to have little bugs that you're dealing with in the workflow, and so that's friction, right? So I kind of just take a Jeff Roberts attitude, which is just like, if I want to do it that way, then yeah, otherwise
Is that the
no.
Jeff Roberts?
Yeah, like
attitude?
Jeff is like, there's quality of life issues that sometimes supersede making the intellectually, tactically best decision.
Okay.
Right? Like if it's kind of close either way, and you would have more fun building your tools, or you would feel like you did something nicer, or you just want to try something, someone on the team who's interested in trying something
Wants to do it.
then that's evidence to do it that way, right?
Okay.
Because people, games take a long time, and it's like people's lives, right? So the working part of their life, and so you just want to make that as good as possible, and sometimes that means don't make people suffer through the terrible thing that you would build, and instead spend some money, but sometimes it means let people do their thing,
Okay.
right?
So it's sort of like
it's very contextual, I think.
maybe you just happen to be interested in this thing, and you know that you're going to have fun doing it. So the extra time is actually gets paid off in morale in some sense, right? It's like you are happier and you're more motivated
or
anyway.
even if the game took longer to ship and cost more, that guy had a good time.
Okay,
right?
yeah.
So it's a
Made their
positive.
life better.
Yeah. So and that's not completely a joke, right? Like when you're in a position where it's like, well, I'm paying people, right? Like you don't want that to be an extractive position where like I am using money as a manipulator to coerce people to produce the product that I want. That's a very antiseptic, mechanical
Henry
way to think
Ford.
about it, right? Well, I don't know him, but sure. But it's more like, okay, you need to have a little bit of that, because otherwise a game is never going to get
Right.
produced. But at the same time, it's like, well, this is how people are spending their working hours, and you actually, at some degree, have to be grateful for that, because they could just leave.
Right.
Especially with a small company like mine, there's not like an influx of people coming in the door.
Right.
People are not beating down the door to work for a company they've never heard of.
Right.
They all want to go work on Overwatch.
Right.
So, you have to be a little bit happy that people there's a
still
give and
there,
take
yeah.
there, right? Like, oh, if someone wants to do this thing, then, and I don't think it's exactly the best, if it's not going to ruin the game, then we'll do it, you know? Even if, and that even comes down to smaller technical decisions, like, should part of the renderer be a certain way?
Right.
I don't see how that's going to really be faster, but he thinks it will be, and
He's
you know,
into
the
it.
reason he's in that programming position is because he's supposed to make decisions, right? So you let people make decisions, I guess. And
I see.
that didn't really answer anything.
It sort of did, though. I mean, that is a additional metric you can use if you're trying to make one of these decisions about, like, should we do this tool, should we not do this tool? One is, does anyone actually going to enjoy making this tool?
Does
right?
anyone? I mean, does anyone ever predict things with high accuracy about whether something is going to be right or not?
Right.
It's. I think in general, we all, even the best of us, have a relatively poor track record.
Yeah.
Like if you were to actually go back and audit your
Yeah.
decisions, right? And so just have that knowledge a priori, like, okay, I think we should license this tool, but I have about 30% confidence in that choice.
Right, right.
So really, whatever,
Right,
right?
okay.
Yeah.
So,
But of course, I'm the guy who takes it forever to ship games, so.
and builds the programming language to ship them in. So here's a question to follow that up, because you happen to sort of be right there at the end of it. What was the process for getting a new puzzle into the witness? Did the engine have a line puzzle editor? Because we're talking about,
It did
tools
not,
like, so
right?
I
The
know.
tool, the process there was that I typed lines into a CPP file and compiled the game and rerun the game. Not even with incremental rebuild, because does that even, like, I guess that works. The PlayStation guys were over at one point, and they said it works on the PS4, but I never even tried it there.
Okay.
I don't work directly on the PS4, but it never worked on PC correctly enough. It would like fail one time out of 6, which is often enough to just like throw it away. No, so, and the reason that happened was just, you know, if you're making a game where you don't exactly know what it is in the beginning, then you can't really know what the tools have to be, right? Especially if it's a very core gameplay thing, like, oh, there's these puzzles. Like, I didn't know what the rules of the puzzles were going to be. I didn't know what kind of things could be in them.
Right. And there's a
I
lot
didn't
of
know-
variety to them.
And there's a lot, and it's very easy if you want to prototype a new idea. Like, maybe the length of what I'm tracing is, like, constrained in some weird way. I can program that pretty fast. Programming a tool for that takes a lot longer,
Yes.
right? Even if it's a crappy tool,
Right.
right? So by the time I knew what the game was, like 2/3 of the puzzles were just already in C++, and like,
Yeah.
why at that point would you
Right.
change it? There were some issues like that, like, hey, I mean, I was very laissez-faire about the whole thing. So like, I'm going to put symbols in the puzzle, so there's going to be a thing where you just like allocate an array, and then you like poke them. I take the graph paper and like count the squares and put it in.
Right.
Or I'd say like, you know, 3 times I plus 4 or whatever to like put, and sometimes the array wasn't big enough and you get some memory write errors, but you do a little bit of like safeguarding to make sure that doesn't happen, and it's fine. So, yeah.
I'm suspecting that was not the answer that they were guessing.
I mean, that's
That's
you
why I
ship
asked
games
it.
however you ship
Yeah.
that game, right?
Yeah.
So,
Okay, let's see here. We've got about 8 minutes left, 9 minutes left until we should take a break, if I'm correct. So let's see what would be a good thing to end on here. How about what has been your happiest moment with programming? It's not directed at anyone.
I think my happiest moment in programming was I wrote this incredibly complex piece of code to do something, and it literally worked the very first time I compiled it. And I just kind of remember being shocked at that. And it's like, okay, I'm done for the day. Right? I'm out of here because this worked the very first time.
What was the code? Do you remember?
I don't remember exactly
Okay.
exactly what the code was, but it involved like a whole bunch of like math and like
Okay.
getting all these. I think it was the animation system. Oh, that's right. It was the animation system. It was getting all of the the pieces of the animation, which were all running on these kind of threaded animation chains, and it's like I worked on this thing for probably the entire afternoon. I remember hitting compile and hitting run, and the guy walked across the screen. That was a very happy moment.
Well, I blogged about one of them, which was like getting the first multiplayer game of Warcraft 1 working. So I'll mention a different one instead. And that
Okay.
was actually doing the Fog of War for StarCraft.
Okay.
Another programmer had gone and done Fog of War, and it was cell-based. And so
Okay.
as a unit would move around the screen, you'd see this map of cells around it, which are 8x8 tiles, and they'd all sort of shiver around as the unit like moved pixel by pixel, and it's trying to recalculate what the light map would look like. And it wasn't very scalable for the number of units we wanted to have, and so it needed to be rewritten. And so I just sort of stepped back and said, what could I do differently? And so I did Garot shading with a filter algorithm to sort of soften all the edges, and then I actually added line of sight as well. So if you had something that was blocking your view, then the Fog of War would be filled in. So if you're at the bottom of a cliff, you can't see up here, and so this area would still be fogged. And it ended up being about the last assembly code I ever really wrote in my career.
Okay.
I mean, maybe a couple of instructions after that, but like that was the last serious block of assembly code because C got to be better. And it took a while to get it nailed down, but it worked and it's beautiful. And line of sight works, and it really makes the game work well.
Right.
So that was a lot of fun to do.
So how long did that take?
I don't know, probably like 2 or 3 weeks, something like that. I'd already done a lot of Fog of War stuff, so I understood the problem space really well.
After the two previous Warcrafts, like
Yeah.
one and two, I guess, would have been. Tommy.
So, right at the end of Meat Boy, I was losing my mind because, as you do. And throughout development, we always had problems with the replay system. It was like, there would be like a block that broke, and it was all input based in the beginning. And it worked well, but it always had these times where it would just totally mess up. And it was 2 days, either a day or 2 days before our Xbox Gold submission. And I'm like, I have to fix this. And what I did is I was on like 4 hours of sleep, and I get up out of my desk and I go and I sit with my back against the wall because it sucks sitting on the floor with nothing. And I didn't have a couch, and I didn't want to sit in the computer chair. So I sit on the floor, back against the wall, and I just closed my eyes for like 30 minutes. And I just thought about how I was going to recode the entire replay system. And after 30 minutes, I was like, okay. And I did it, and first time. And that's the one that shipped. So, yeah. Yeah. That was some weird superhuman, lifting the car off the baby. That's what that was. Yeah, I don't think I could ever do that again. So.
Meditative coding.
Yeah, pretty much.
John.
I'm thinking of 2, and it's about a tie between them.
You've got at least 4 minutes. You could do both.
So they're both kind of recent. One of them is probably from about 2 or 3 years ago, and it's from a side project game that I was working on during The Witness. And you know this game, but most people do not. So I won't go into that much detail about what it is, but it was still in the relatively early stages where you're not trying that hard on the graphics or whatever, so it's very easy to create results. And I had a period of just like 3 to 5 weeks when I was working on The Witness during the day. I'd go to a cafe or go home after work, and I was just then working on this all the way until it was time to go to sleep. I'd eat whatever was fast. I'd fall asleep. I'd wake up. I'd go right back to working on the side project, and I'd go do The Witness during the day. And something about there's just this like you're trying to ship this big game, and it's like, oh man, there's so much to do. And you go and you can make something happen very quickly. And it was coming out really great, right? There's this joy of like when you're a programmer designer and you have ideas and can make the ideas happen and they really work, it's just really nice. And so there was just this time of like where I was just completely content to do nothing else in life, but like wake up and first thing in the morning I was doing this, right? And then I'd go do Witness stuff. So I can't even explain why that was. It just was. You have to take my word for it. It was really nice. And then the second one is more recent, is on the compiler that I was working on. And maybe toward the end of 2014, beginning of 2015, when that first started coming online, even in the first few months of development of that, it's again, compilers are another area where it's easy to make a great deal of progress relatively quickly. before you start getting bogged down later with implementation details. And I have enough programming experience. There's a way that you can capitalize on that effect, right? And structure your code to not bog you down for a while, right? And that's one thing that I feel like is my personal style, is about thinking about that. Like I got the compile time compilation working, and I did this demo where you can run the same program at compile time and release time or whatever. And I was just super happy with that, and it was not that complicated of a system. And I knew, like, if I already can do this and it's not very complicated, then the rest of it is going to be tractable, right? And I was a case then when I just kept jamming on it, and new results came in and worked well, and progress was fast. So because of that, because of all of my experiences of when programming is the best, is when progress doesn't take forever, when it's not like pulling teeth to get anything done, right? But that's so much of like what current day programming is, even down to compile times or whatever, right? So the other aspect of that psychology was like looking at the misery of like programming in C++ every day, and being like, oh my God, I really do have a way out of this. It was like, I see a light up there, and I'm actually managing to get towards it, right? And there was this release of all this dread that I'd had, because otherwise I had already convinced myself that I was just gonna have to put up with that for the rest of my life.
Right.
And get done what I was doing despite that. Right. It's like, oh, games are hard enough, but I've also got to do them while holding this like 50-pound weight on my shoulder. 50 pounds C++. Yeah. And it was like, spec if you print it out. It was like, oh my God, I don't have to do that. So we'll see if that part actually comes true and I finish the thing. But like the feeling of that was amazing. The hope is amazing when you can have it, right?
Correct.
That's like one of those books you can buy in the checkout aisle, I think, right? Hope is Amazing If You Can Have It, by Jonathan Lowe.
2016, that's
Daily Programming Affirmations. All right, well, we're going to take a break here. Thank you all for sharing. We'll be back in 15 minutes.